Good morning and welcome. My name is Pierre Lambert. I'm a travel adventure photographer, and you're on a special session on street photography and the impact of lenses on your photos. Oh yeah. How come those two photos give you a completely different feeling? What was the impact of lenses? Why did I choose a certain focal length for that photo and then I chose another one for that photo? What exactly goes through my mind? Which ones are my favorite? I'm going to be sharing with you exactly how you can think about choosing the right lens for your street photography. If you've never heard of me, as I mentioned, my name is Pierre Lambert. I'm a travel adventure photographer, and for the past years, I've been the host of 2 YouTube channels in French and in English around photography, where I share all the behind the scenes of how I got the photos that you will see today. And on top of that, I also teach photography through my workshops for people who want to take it to the next level or get into the game. All right, today, what is street photography? Why does gear matter? We've all heard the saying, gear doesn't matter. But our gear are just tools. And just like you wouldn't plant any nail with any hammer, certain types of lenses will give you better results for your creative vision. Again, at the end of the day, as a photographer, you're a creator, you're an artist, you have a creative vision, you might be witnessing something, you want to document it, and depending on the tool you're going to be using, you will have completely different results, and your viewer who is looking at those images will be impacted completely differently. You want to leave an emotional trace on them, you want them to feel like they're getting what you had in mind, maybe the story, maybe the place, and for that, certain lenses will work better. So before we get into my favorites and why and the impact of those lenses through photos, I want to highlight a few questions that you can ask yourself for choosing the right lens for your street photography. The first one is going to be, how discreet do you want to be? Do you want to be running around the streets with a giant lens like a 70-200, or would you feel more comfortable with a tiny 85 1.8, for example? Are you shy? That's a good question. And are you okay to interact with people, or do you want to capture everything from a distance without ever interacting? Meaning, do you want just genuine shots from afar, or are you ready to go talk to those people in the streets when you're traveling? Are you ready to engage with them, maybe to set up a different shot that can highlight what they're doing in a better light or better angle? Or do you want to be the shadow on the wall that moves around and just takes photos and captures basically life happening around you? As photographers, we're storytellers. We're here to share our vision of the world, what we see, what we find interesting, and those questions will kind of help you decide which lens, which gear will work better for your style. And obviously the last 2 questions would be around, what is your budget for that gear? And also, how much are you ready to carry when you're going out there in the streets? There is something I tell everyone who actually learns with me photography. I always say the most important is to have your camera with you at all time, especially during the learning phase when you're really getting out there. And if you're doing a lot of street photography, you always want to have your camera ready to shoot. A phone can work, but if you have a dedicated camera and it's in your backpack, well, it's not gonna be helpful. So instead of having the best lens, the biggest, with the best aperture, maybe something a little smaller, compact, will actually make you have more photos, and more photos means more opportunities to get the right shot, the one shot that might make you be discovered or that you might fall in love with, and that next thing you know, you absolutely want to print it because you want to hang it out there on those walls, or some people want to buy it from you. So it's not about getting just what is considered to be the best. It's really about finding what will work right for you. Okay, I'm gonna share with you what works perfectly for me, and I'm gonna share that through a few examples of photos that I have prepared for you right there. And I gotta be honest, my style of photography is not just pure photography. I do a mix of street photography with a little bit of lifestyle and a lot of travel. But for me, travel photography and street photography is kind of the same. The difference is that it's street photography that I do abroad. I do it in places I don't know, with people I don't know. It gets very exciting and you can capture and bring back those stories to others. I was recently in Tanzania. We're gonna see some of those photos. Maybe some of you have seen the behind the scenes on YouTube, and it will be great for you to understand why I use certain lenses for those photos. We're gonna also review some Japan, New York, and some Mexico photos just to show you my favorite lenses. When you get started in the street photography world, you might realize quickly that 35mm is really a staple in that world where people swear by it, they shoot with it. You might have seen cameras who have just the 35mm mounted on, and that's great. But there's also a place for other lenses. And a question a lot of people ask me is that, should I go for a zoom lens and have versatility when I shoot, or should I go for a prime lens? And that question is very, very important. I'm gonna share a little story with you of one of those photos that I took at a market in Arusha in Tanzania. I started to shoot around the streets with actually my 16 to 35mm lens right there. And it's something I usually don't do for street photography because I love the feeling that I get from shooting prime lens. It makes me move, it makes me interact differently with subject, it pushes me creatively to get somewhere. But because I was getting to a place I've never shot, I actually didn't know how the place would look, how it would feel, and what kind of lens I might use. Was the space confined? Would it be wide? Would I have a lot of room to shoot, or would everything be cramped up? And in order to get that versatility and explore the place, I actually use my zoom lens. And you can see some of those shots are done with the zoom lens, and then at one point I changed and I moved over to my 50mm lens, the f1.2 that we have right there, because I had a good understanding of what the place was like, what I could do, and this is one of the most important things. Zoom lenses will give you that versatility and will allow you to be like a ninja when you're in a spot. You can shoot tight, you can shoot wide. If you have a 24-70, you really have a massive range. You'll be able to do portraits, but also shoot wide, and shooting wide will give you a completely different feeling. But there is a big trade-off. Look at the size between those two lenses, or those two. You're gonna have to choose as a photographer, how much are you ready to carry with you when you're on the streets? Are you ready to take heavy lenses, or do you want something that is going to be lighter? The trade-off will be versatility. I find that over time, there's a place for both, yet every time I feel that I'm a little secure in my thought process about a specific location or the stories I'm trying to tell, I will actually switch automatically to my prime lenses and leave the zoom lenses in my backpack. The 70-200 is almost an exception because it's such a long focal range that it's going to be for very specific shots. And I even heard people say you can't do street photography with a 70-200. Well, let me tell you, you can do it with whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Don't let anyone tell you the other way. So primes are going to be cheaper, sharper, have an aperture that goes usually way lower. We have 1.8 here, 1.4 here, and the zoom, you're gonna have versatility, but you're gonna pay the price in weight, in budget, and also your aperture is going to be a little higher. So some places you don't need to shoot at 1.8, some places you can get away with 2.8, f4, 5.6, but sometimes if you're shooting at nighttime, for example, and you really need to keep your images clean, like on that one, well, that 1.4 might save your shot. That's for the debate between zoom and primes. There is no good answer, no bad answer. I just find that it's a completely different approach. You move differently, you interact with people differently, depending on if you're a zoom or a prime. Now, let's get to my favorite and why I use them for street photography. I'm gonna save you the suspense. My favorites are the 85mm f1.8. It is small, compact, allows me to have some compression and shoot from a little further, also do some really nice portraits and have that creamy background. In my top three, now I also have the 50mm f1.2. The 50mm lens is like a staple in photography. It's something I think everyone beginning should start at one point, but I hadn't been shooting with it for a few years and I found it magical to shoot again with it. Then I have the 24mm 1.4 and the 20mm 1.8 are my other wide favorite lenses. Honestly, most people might think it's the 35 1.4. I love this lens, it has its place in my bag, but those are the three lenses I need if I go on a trip and I want to be light, compact, and really be able to get the shots I want. I mean, this one's not super light, but we'll get over that. You'll see why in a second. Let's get to some of those photos and let me show you how I used those different lenses, okay? So let's start with the 85mm. How does 85mm help me in my photography? Well, 85mm helped me get a lot of compression in my photos, meaning I'm able to add layers in my photos that feel really close to each other, and also being able to shoot from a little further. So for example, that shot in Japan or the lady crossing the street, you can see that she really pops out. She feels like she's in the foreground. The background blurs out really nicely. I was shooting at f2.2 on that one. This shot was the lady was walking in the rain and was lit up by the side by that little shop, and again shot at f2.2. My ISO went up to 4000. I could have shot with a slower shutter speed, but really that 85 allows me to have the background go fully creamy and my subject to be sharp, right? And same concept on that little series with those red gates that I really love. It was a door and people kept passing by and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. The people change, but the frame doesn't. And I really love that concept where you're using actually that compression to make them feel like they're like stuck against the wall almost, and people just change. And there was a cross on the sign, and the 85 allowed me to shoot from the other side of the street, as you can see, and I felt discreet. You know, I didn't feel like I had a giant lens on me, and I felt a little better about being out there, you know. And at the end of the day, you must be comfortable as a photographer. You must push yourself a little bit of your comfort zone sometimes. But for the most part, if you can be in a zone where you feel creative and comfortable, you'll be able to do a lot more, in my opinion. Another example of a focal length that I like but don't use much would be the 70-200. This is a great photo, a great example where you get a lot of compression. That was shot at 155mm during the henge. You get a creamy background, your subject pops. This is great, but this one is really painful to travel with or to walk around with. You're working out the whole time. So this is why I go for that 85mm, honestly. So overall, 85mm for me is great to get that outsider's perspective on a scene. I feel that I can shoot and give you a context and give you something. You don't necessarily feel like you're immersed in the scene, but you're looking at it from a external point of view, and I like that, and it has its place in my storytelling, honestly. So now let's move on to that 24mm f1.4, which is a lens that I found to really appreciate because it is small, mighty, it is light, and it shoots very, very wide open at f1.4, which allows me to get some of those photos where you feel a little more immersed, or I can get more of the scene, right? For example, on that photo that was shot in Tokyo, we have the whole temple in the background, a little bit on the left, right there, and my subject is walking across there with his phone. And the goal here was to get that whole scene. If I had shot that at 85mm, I would have had to be really much further. The sides with that building would look different, and a lot would have changed in that image. And I don't think it would have worked as well, in my opinion. Here, I really like the effect that 24 gave me. It allows me also to be small and discreet because it's a fairly small lens, has a small footprint in my backpack, and it really helps take those photos at night. Same focal length, or at least 23mm, but that was shot with my zoom lens. And that was one of those times where, again, I didn't know what I was gonna shoot, where I was. I was in New York City, and I used that lens actually to scout the locations. It did allow me to get really cool shots, like this guy crossing the street, really pops out, being hit by a little bit of light in the background. That 23mm, which is the same, that focal length actually gives you a little bit of wide angle view, but without too much distortion. And I really like that. It gives you the whole context without feeling like you distorted people. And I mentioned the 20mm, which is kind of the brother of that 24mm. It's a f1.8. What I really liked with it is that it's a tiny bit wider and you can do a lot more with that 4mm extra. Now, I will say for most people, especially in the streets, I find that 20mm is going to be a little too wide, and you might feel like you're always too far from the action. And unless you're like absolutely not shy and you're ready to go in people's faces, discuss with them, or like shoot super close to object, I find that 20mm might be a little bit too wide for my taste. So 24 works beautifully. And you remember what I said about that 85mm allowing you to actually be outside of the action and shooting into the action? Well, this is a great example of how it works. That was shot during the protests in Chicago in 2020, and you can see that I didn't have to be too close to those people, to that cop. We have the background that feels really close. With the compression at 85mm, it feels like it's really happening behind him. You can get a little bit of context. The buildings are really high, so you don't need really to shoot ultra wide. And in a situation like that where there's protests going on, lots happening, having a small lens for me was really key to moving around swiftly, being discreet, and not feel like I was gonna get targeted by either protest or police. And it was a really great lens, honestly, to use. I was happy. Now, one of my new favorite lens is that 50mm f1.2. Why that 50? 50 is that perfect sweet spot between that 24 wide and that kind of really tight 85mm or 135mm range, where I feel like we can get a little bit of context into our image and at the same time really isolate our subject and get to the point in the photo. For me, photography is all about that. It's about making you see what I want you to see very quickly. If you're like fiddling and you don't know what I tried to take, I probably failed at my shot. So that little series on the beach with a fisherman, for example, is a good example. We get the beach context, we get a little bit of the ocean, the guy walking, and then I have a few more of him fishing, and then after he's like, hey, actually we're striking a conversation, he's like, hey, look at what I fished, and I was able to shoot him with his fishes, and it wasn't too tight where I had to be like 300 feet away with the 85mm. I was at a reasonable distance where you can still have human interactions without shouting, which is key in many circumstances. Another example of that 50mm shot a little bit low to the ground, isolate the person in the background, have some layers in the foreground happening and even in the background. And at the end of the day, shooting that wide open might feel a little scary at times because you might miss your focus because it's so shallow. But for me, it really allows me to bring out my subject. It doesn't mean that I never shoot at f4, it just means that I like to play with that. Especially when I can shoot through elements, that 50mm will work great. Getting the same shots at 24 or 35 will be a little harder, but you'll see why. And you can really get those shots with with your background, again, a little bit compressed, but not too much, where it feels kind of natural. It feels like if I was there in the street, I would see it like that. Now, when we were in Tanzania, I actually went on a session with a 35mm f1.4. It's a beautiful lens. I've talked about it in the past on the YouTube channel. I absolutely love it, and it has its place in context like that where I didn't want to take my big zoom. I wanted something a little more discreet, but I didn't want to be too wide where I would get too close to people, and because I didn't know the place, and also I didn't want to move around with a big lens like a 51.2. So I used that 35mm, was able to really connect with the locals from a human distance when we're talking and get those photos without making them feel too intrusive. 35 also gave me that really nice sweet spot where you can have context on your images, you know, you can see what you're shooting around, you can have your subject in the area. So honestly, you can't go wrong as to which lens to use. It will give you a completely different feeling. Here is one last example. So we shot this at 50mm. We were visiting the Datoga tribe in Tanzania. Actually, our guide, that was his own village. He showed us around, introduced us to his family, and we got some really cool shots. And now to wrap it up, really, I want to show you what I captured while we're photoing the Hadzabe tribe on a full day hunt with them on the field. I took two lenses with me, actually three. I had the 70-200 in my backpack. I had the 20mm f1.8 and the 50mm f1.2. The reason I had the 70-200 is that I thought maybe we're gonna have to take photos of animals really far out. My goal was to document the process and have people be immersed in the experience. So I needed those wide shots that will feel you that you're sucked in, and also some context shots, some detail shots. So I was gonna play with the different focal length. I actually never ended up using the 70-200 because I had to open the backpack. It wasn't conducive for that in the experience, and this was heavy because we're running all the time. There's a full behind the scenes on YouTube, but I'm showing you a few examples right now. I'm literally following one of the huntsmen right now. I'm probably gonna get lost. Let's go. Not sure what there is. No way, look at the turn. I'll show you exactly why I used which lens for which shots. So first shots right there is a wide shot. I wanted to make you feel like you're walking with them, that you're literally close to the ground and you're seeing how it's working. Second one of the hunter got a bird, and 50mm really allowed me to actually isolate my subject at f2.8, the background blurred out. We didn't need too much context as to that. It was more focused on the humane aspect of catching the prey and then putting it down and putting it away for later. Then again, 20mm low to the ground gives you that feeling of really walking with them, being there. And I actually tried something else. As you may see, we have that bird shot at 50mm, but then they caught another animal and I shot that same scene at 20mm. And as you may feel, you feel completely different between this one and this one. One feels like you're looking a little bit from further, and one feels like you're literally in the action. So here, same example, I actually switched to the 16-35 that we were using for filming quickly to get a shot of one of the Hadzabe tribesmen while he's walking, and I shot that very close to him to get that feeling of being right there behind him, actually in this adventure. And then switched again to the 50mm to get some portrait shots. I don't want the background, I want to focus on the face. Switched to 16mm because they were explaining things with the arrows, and at 16mm I was able to get a little bit of context around the people, but also get the movements, and that 16mm distorts things a little bit, right? So when you get close, things look a little bigger, so you're able to get those stretched out movements which will drag you a little more into the photo. Again, 50mm back for portraits, and then I wanted some more wide portraits because I love those. They give you that different feeling, as you may see. And once more, here, look at the difference between a 50mm shot that gives you the context on what is happening. They're preparing a fire to actually cook their breakfast, and a 20mm shot while they're cooking. You have a completely different feeling. One feels like you're looking from outside, and one feels literally like you're sitting with them at the fire and you're looking at what's happening. So that's how I approach my choice in photography. Do I want to be externally looking at what's happening and feel like I get a good sense of a scene, or do I want to feel immersed in it? At the end of the day, your lens choice will dictate how your viewer will feel. And you have to consider a few things: how you want them to feel and how you want to feel when you're shooting. So to wrap it up, if you're doing street photography, you have to choose if you want to be more discreet and shooting from afar, or if you want to get really close to the action. If you're ready to do that, go for wider lenses. If you're really shy and you want to look at it from an external point of view, then shoot with longer focal range. I would say starting at 50, going up to 135. And if you're really not shy, try 16mm or even 14mm f1.8. I can tell you this is a real experience. But again, if I'm getting in a new country that I don't know and I don't know how the people will react and etc., it might be a little too much for me to go straight to 14. I might try it once I'm more comfortable, or at least I know how I will be received, because that's one of the big thing also that you might be asking yourself. I don't want to bother people when I'm taking photos. Well, again, you gotta gauge it with them. You gotta ask maybe people, hey, can I take photos of you? Is that okay? And try to make their day better when you leave than it was before. If they don't want, that's totally okay. If they're happy with you taking photos, great. do it, be happy, make them smile, and continue your adventures, share the love in a way. So you guys can ask any questions. I'm gonna be here on the live and we can discuss and dive a little bit more into those lenses or into your choices for your gear in street photography and travel photography. So let me know if you have any questions, and remember, get out there, go shoot, try something different, try something new. No matter what kind of gear you're using, practicing might be just as important as choosing the right lens.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Be Alpha Live. I'm Christopher Robinson, editor of alphauniverse.com and host of the Alpha Universe podcast, and I'm joined live with Pierre Lambert. Pierre, thanks very much for being here today.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Hope you have enjoyed the class so far. And Christopher, thanks for having me.
It's really a pleasure, and this is a live Q&A. Please put your questions into the chat. We'll be taking as many of them as we can. And Pierre, I'd just like to start. We had a question that came in about the color palette in your photos. So I'm going to read this one. It's a little bit of a long question. Your photos have a distinctive color combination. Do you change color selection with the place and time? And how much do you allow yourself to change the color scheme without losing consistency of your signature style?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. So the question is around color palette and if I'm changing it and how do I keep it consistent. And I think just in that question, there's like actually maybe 2 more or 3 questions that as an artist we can ask ourselves is A, should we be consistent no matter where we are? And B, what does consistency means? Does it mean giving the feel of the place, or does it mean being consistent to ourselves? And the last one I would say is around how do you actually find that color palette, like you mentioned, Christopher. I'll start with the first one. What happens is that depending on where I go, I'm gonna feel differently about a place. And I can't edit the same way if I'm in French Polynesia or in the Pacific Northwest or if I'm in the streets of Chicago. There are certain things that will be consistent, but some things, like for example, the easiest in the colors is going to be the green. Some greens are going to be very vibrant in certain places and others a lot less. And for me, as a photographer, as an artist, it's all about finding that balance between this is what I want to do and this is how the place looked to my eyes, because I still have that documentary approach sometimes where I try not to modify too much the colors based on what I see in real life. And we've seen many, many examples of greens that are being toned down drastically, saturation goes down, luminance goes down, and it can work very well, make something very moody. But if I'm in tropical places and my palm tree looks more like a very dark green, I feel like it doesn't work. So in order for me to find a consistency, what I try to do is work with series and work with series of locations. So if I'm in tropical locations, I'm gonna create a theme around it that I find works well for that place and kind of gives you the vibe of that place. If I'm going in a city, I feel the city is a little moody, there's a lot happening, there is that Gotham City vibe to it, then yeah, I might desaturate a lot what you might see in your images or certain colors to actually make you feel what I'm feeling as an artist. And I think the colors are actually the best way ever for you to understand how we feel as artists when we're looking at something, at a place. Depending on the colors we're going to give a dominance to or the ones we're going to tone down, it will help you as a viewer actually emotionally feel things differently.
I think that's a really great answer. Certainly lots of parts to that question, and really a lot to think about. Color is always such a huge part of an image and how you kind of manipulate it depending on the situation and the mood you're trying to create. We got a question that came in asking, when you're shooting, do you frequently change lenses or do you carry multiple bodies with different lenses on them?
So the question around changing lenses is really interesting because it's always a debate. It's always like that thing where you want to go out with a lot of lenses and then you end up on the field. And what happens is that if you start having too many lenses, you end up with the dilemma of choices. and you almost get stuck. I feel like I almost get stuck creatively if I have too much gear, because I'm going to be like, oh, maybe that shot would be better with that 14 or with that 35 or that 85. And I end up switching in my mind versus concentrating on just one lens. So if possible, again, it depends if I'm going in my city where I live right now, or if I'm on a trip where I might have 2, 3 lenses. But let's say I'm in my home city. What I will love to do, and you might have seen it on YouTube in the videos, is I'll take just one lens. For example, that 50-1.2 or an 85-1.8, and literally spend 2 hours with just that one lens. Creatively, it actually adds boundaries, but boundaries for me are freeing, meaning it pushes you to think within those boundaries creatively of different shots, of different style, of how you can actually achieve what you're trying to shoot and document that place. Now, if I use different lenses, what might happen is that I might try to split it in two. I'm going to take all the tight shots first, or I'm going to take all my wide shots first and literally switch. But I try not to go back and forth between two lenses, because it's a mental muscle to switch every time. And I feel like when you're using that mental muscle a little bit too much, you're actually distracting yourself from the creative and the storytelling part.
If you had to take just one lens with you, what lens would it be? Especially for a situation where you didn't necessarily know what to expect.
Okay, so the one lens, if I don't know anything about the place and I don't know what to expect, is usually the 16-35. I always have it in my bag for the video side of it things. But like in Tanzania, I didn't know how I would feel about the market, how it would be. I started with that lens, and it gave me a good idea, because I could take the 35 or the 16 shots and see, am I going to be close to people? I'm going to be far. And that allows me to move around. And once I have a better feel of the place, I'm going to switch to a prime lens usually. Another great option would be the 24-70, but I actually don't carry that in my bags. I actually don't own one. I've just played with it a few times, and I love it. It's really versatile. If you don't know a place, you can literally explore with that lens.
Talking about that 16-35, which gives you a little bit of a wider perspective. When you're shooting with that lens, do you find that you do more editing down the road, or do you let the distortion that's naturally inherent in those wider focal lengths just kind of go?
Good question on the distortion. I actually love the distortion at 16, and I hardly ever correct it unless it's very obvious on buildings. And I'm shooting, for example, let's say a door frame with a building, and I'm slightly at an angle, that I will correct. But if I'm shooting wide portraits, if I'm shooting the city wide or people very wide, I actually love the distortion, because I feel like it's a very particular trait, and it brings you differently into the image. If I'm trying to make it mathematically good looking or correct, I feel like it's lacking a little bit of that let's call it emotion behind it, that personal touch.
In those situations where you are changing lenses, do you have any particular techniques for keeping the sensor and the back of the lens clean?
I'm probably the worst to ask about keeping a sensor clean, but if you're changing in the street your gear and you're removing the lens, just keep your sensor face down, and usually that's enough. If you're in an environment where it's actually snowing and it's light snowflakes, or it's there's a lot of wind and dust, I don't have many tips except just do it quickly as possible. Or if you're on the A1, you can close the shutter when you're removing the lens. But honestly, I've just tried to be sweep and quick when I do it. And if you have a wind, dust blower with you, just dust it just before you switch, just after you remove the lens and before you put on the next one.
Pierre, in your talk, you talked about using longer focal lengths and getting a little bit of compression. Can you speak to that a little bit more, especially for people who aren't necessarily super familiar with telephoto compression?
Yeah, so the good question around telephoto lens. I have a 7200 here and an 85 millimeter. The question around compression is that feeling that objects in the background are closer to the objects in the foreground than if you're shooting with a wider lens. Let's say you shoot with a wide lens, and actually this is kind of wide. If you're seeing me here, right there, if you see my hand, we're 24 millimeter right there, I look far from my hand, right? You can see it, I look pretty far. If we're at 85 millimeter and I was trying to do the same movement, I would be further, but that distance, perceived distance between my hand and myself would look like it's on the same plane almost. And that's why we talk about compression, because suddenly the background that's behind me, look, it's going to look closer. So it's actually bringing, let's say, tall buildings in a city that seem very far away very close. And that's something that you can play with. Let's say you have someone crossing the street, you take that person crossing the street at 85 or 200 millimeter. The buildings that are in the background are going to appear very close. If you shoot it at 16 millimeter, what is going to happen is that that background is going to look very far. So it's great to play actually with that and that feeling that you get depending on the lens you will use.
And you had mentioned about, using that effect to create layers within the composition. And I think that's a little bit, actually that's fundamentally different from wide angle, where we tend to use the wide angle distortion to kind of move people's eyes through the image, versus creating this really layered effect that you get with that telephoto compression. And sort of thinking about that while you're in the moment is, it can be sort of a challenging thing, but you kind of let the moment dictate exactly which approach you want to have.
Yes, I feel like that compression is a great tool, but you have to be careful not to abuse it, because especially when you're in cities, it gets so nice and easy to actually bring the background and make those buildings look big. But after a while, I feel like if you shoot it with a wide angle just to train, even if you don't want to use it all the time, just to train actually to be able to make your subject stand a little bit more out. And how do you use, like you said, Christopher, how do you use those elements around you to lead towards your subject, without having to snipe into it? I feel like those wide angles, that's why I love them. Even 14 millimeter, what elements are you gonna be using? If I'm using 14, I'm gonna shoot way lower to the ground, because I need to use that ground level, that first plane, to actually bring you to my subject.
We got a question about how much time you usually spend on editing a typical photo.
About 30 seconds. No. It depends. If I'm going through a series, honestly, it's not very long. If that image requires a lot of local editings, for those of you who follow me on YouTube, you might have realized I use a lot of presets that I create. There's nothing wrong. If you've ever heard that presets are bad, there's nothing wrong with presets. Presets are awesome. I highly encourage anyone, you go to a new place, a new city, and you like the feeling you created with one image, save those edits as a presets and try to apply them on different images. And then you can tweak things to actually bring that consistency throughout the same theme. And that's what I do. So I have about 30 to 60 that I use on a regular basis. And I actually go through them and adapt them based on if the location is different, and then I will do local adjustments. So if I don't have to do local adjustments, it's usually 30 seconds. If I do local adjustments, it can take anywhere from 1 minute to 15 minutes if I really want to push things.
Sometimes I feel like when you're spending a whole lot of time editing a photo, the photo is trying to tell you to move on with your life and do something else.
Yeah, and the worst for me is if I open Photoshop, I'm just gonna spend an hour and then quit Photoshop, look again at what I did on Lightroom. I was like, I actually might have looked better before. But it's all about the process. Don't worry if you get frustrated about that. The process of like editing and going back and feeling that it was too much, coming back, turning it down, is totally normal. Everyone goes through it. And even myself, I go back and forth. And if you spend a lot of time on a photo, my best advice is leave it. Like you said, Christopher, move on with your life, come back on it tomorrow. And it usually flows a lot easier.
We are live with Pierre Lambert. We're taking your questions. Please put your questions into the chat. And Pierre, I wanted to ask you about when you're photographing people, how much do you show them the photos that you're taking?
Ooh, when shooting people, how often do I show them the photos? If possible, and if I interacted with them 100% of the time, I will be like, hey, you want to see? And people usually say yes, because they're very curious. They're like, okay, this guy came out of nowhere. I don't know him and I don't know them. Let's see what he did with just now. And people get excited to see the photo. Now, if I shooting from far, in rare cases, I will go and show them, because I don't want to disturb them. If I didn't interact with them, there was a reason. Maybe they're busy, maybe they're working, maybe they're crossing and going away. I don't want to spend the time. But if it's like a crazy photo, I'm like, oh my god, that person needs that photo for themselves. I will sometimes chase the person and show them. Otherwise, what I'm trying to do, and that you guys might have seen for Tanzania, I had the idea. A bunch of you gave it to me also, so everyone's on the same page. I want to bring a portable printer and like literally give people some photos on location, especially when I go to places where people don't necessarily have an email address available or whatsoever. So if possible, I want to bring it. And also, even if they have emails, having a paper photo, like holding a photo in your hand, has like such a different feeling.
And you can be in parts of the world where that paper photo can really become a treasured item for that person.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people don't have photos of themselves. We sort of take it for granted in a world where we're scrolling on our screens all the time and looking at Instagram, but it's a big deal.
And also what I like to remind people is, think about the impact you have when you go places, especially places that maybe feel remote to you or completely different. It's like you're taking something from that experience, right? You're actually going there to experience something. But think about how you can also make others experience you coming there in a better way. Like, how do you make their day feel better? How do you actually show them and bring the best of you, and share a little bit of that with them? And I feel like being able to print the photos and give them on location is my next step.
Pierre, did you go to photo school or have any formal training?
Nope, I was self-taught. I just trained really, really hard when I decided to go pro, and yeah, day and night, every weekend, shooting with anyone who would be open for it, doing free shoots. And over time, I would just benchmark myself with professional photographers and ask other people to rank also my work compared to them. And when I felt like I was there, I'm like, okay, people are ready to pay me, and I feel like my work is just as good, if not better.
Can you talk a little bit more about, sort of that process for you, about the work that you studied and how you studied it, and how you kind of just grinded on it?
Yeah, for sure. So the way back then, there used to be most of the day education started to be a little bit online, but I had a few old school books from like the 80s. And what's interesting with photography is nothing has really changed since, um, I don't know, in the past 100 years almost. It's all about light composition, a few settings, and how you're going to set up your shots. And yes, digital changed the game, but if you learn how to interact with people, how to work with the light and all that first, I think it makes a big difference. So the way I taught myself was, first, I wanted to learn a little bit about what has the most impact on my photos. Is it going to be the light? Is it going to be my gear, the compositions? Once I figured that out, I started working with people, because I had no experience working with portraits. Shooting people, I didn't feel comfortable. I thought I was the worst guy to do that, but actually kind of enjoyed the process, surprisingly. And I was like, oh, I guess I could do that more. And so I continued training. And really, every time, the most important, if you're learning on your own, is just to actually be nicely critical towards yourself. After a session, look at your photos and think about what you were trying to do. Going out there with the goal is how you will progress. So you have a goal of shooting that type of photo. Maybe you can take inspiration, and then you compare what you got with what you wanted to get, and you try to understand what was the gap, why did you fail at it, and how can you improve it. And then you just find materials around that, and then you go back out there and you reiterate that process. It's also kind of how I build my workshop program online, to actually train people. It's really that approach of iteration and small steps that really build up over time.
We are live with Pierre Lambert. We are taking your questions. And Pierre, we got a question about stitching photos and asking if you ever stitch telephoto shots together to get more of the scene while still maintaining that compression.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna butcher the name, so I'm not gonna even try. But there is a technique, which is basically, for those who don't know the technique, you basically, let's say, take a 85 millimeter photo, and you take maybe like 8 photos all around the area where you're trying to shoot, and you stitch them together to make uh, the same effect as if it was a 35 millimeter, maybe, meaning you would have the same angle of view, but you're going to have the compression of that 85 millimeter. I've done it a few times, honestly, but with my style of shooting, it's usually it's a lot more work, and it's in rare cases that I will be sitting and like thinking about that specific shot for a long time. But I've used it, and with clients, it's really great, especially if you're doing like portrait shoots. That can really change a little bit how you shoot. If you're always shooting the same thing, try to do it.
When you are making a series, do you set the white balance in camera, or do you use auto white balance and correct it in post?
Oh, I changed my mind over white balance over time. I used to always shoot in auto white balance because if you shoot raw, there is no reason not to. You can always change it later. But if you're shooting weddings, if you're shooting a lot of people, if you have massive series you're shooting, actually having your consistent white balance across a series will save you a lot of time editing, because what happens is that sometimes the camera changed by just 10, 100, 200 kelvins, the temperature, and it just makes small variations across your images. So if you want something really consistent, what I do nowadays is I just set it in camera, let's say daylight or cloudy, and I will do my series with that and change it when I change environment. But if I'm running, gunning on travel shoot, I don't know where I'm going, how it's gonna be, or I'm gonna in and out of buildings, I leave it in auto and fix it in post if necessary. Honestly, most of the cameras nowadays are doing a great job at the white balance.
Do you shoot in RAW mostly, or do you shoot JPEG, or a combination?
Never JPEGs, always shooting in RAW.
We had a question about your favorite city for street photos, or if you haven't, or if there's one city that you haven't been to that you really want to go to.
Ooh, favorite city for street photography? Tokyo is really, really fun. Tokyo and New York, I would say, are two very diametrically opposed cities and the vibe you get, but they're both so interesting to shoot, in my opinion. And another third one would be San Francisco, because you have so many like hills and you can really play with having people on that sky background.
What's your favorite thing about being a street and travel photographer? And by the way, I love that in your presentation you talked about how to you they're kind of the same thing, street and travel photography.
Yeah. I mean, when some people are like, this is not street photography, I'm like, well, just because I'm doing street photography in another country, it's still street photography. Think about all the people who live there and are actually shooting the same thing that I call travel photography. For them, it's just sometimes it's street. So I think they're just like married together, street and travel. So how it's difficult sometimes to answer. I feel like when you're doing street, you just got to stay very open, and you can be a little more close when it's your own city, meaning you know it. But when you're doing on a travel shoot, you really want to stay as open as possible as to what's around you.
We got a question. I'm going to read this one because it's a little bit longer. If you have to mention 2 or 3 resources or elements that work really well in street photography, what would they be? For example, something like reflections. Do you use them a lot?
Mhm. Yeah, so elements that work great for street photography, definitely reflection. It really allows you to remove a dimension in your image and just focus on the one you prefer. And also, placing stuff in front of your lens is beautiful. Let's say you're shooting through 2 red lights or a lamp pole or something, or using it to mask part of your image. So that's a trick I really love to do. And the last one is just shooting low to the ground, honestly, and using the streets or those street crossings in those photos. I feel like it's always something safe to go back to.
If you had a single piece of advice to give to somebody who is trying to really improve their street and travel photography, what would it be?
So if it's street photography, it's just go out and shoot more. If you feel like you're not progressing, find examples of your favorite photographers and try to recreate that, and then spin it off in your own style once you nailed the technical parts around it and you're able to recreate that. And if it's travel, travel more, honestly. I think we all have that idea of wanting to be travel photographers, but don't end up traveling as much as we would like. We just take 2 holidays a year and we're like, yeah, that's not going to work. So traveling more and just keep your camera at hand at all times. You'll see it will change how you feel about things. You're not going to think about reaching for your camera in your bag, you're going to be like, I already have it. Why would I not take that photo? And it's a digital, so you don't like it, it's okay. Just delete it later.
Do you ever do any kind of panning shots? And if you do, what kind of lens do you use with them?
Ooh, panning shots are the best. Panning, I've used anything from 85 millimeter to 24. I think the sweet spot might be around 35, usually for me for panning shots, or maybe sometimes 50 millimeters. But honestly, for panning shots, usually I try to find cities where there's a lot of stuff or lights in the background, like in New York City or around Times Square, or in Japan. There's a lot of really big crossings on the street, and I feel like it adds another dimensions to have those versus just a plain background.
Pierre, it's really been super great talking to you today. The chat has been alive with great comments and questions. Really appreciate you being here. It's a pleasure to have you at Be Alpha Live.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Christopher, and thank you for everyone who watched, and thank you for your questions. Hope you have enjoyed.